Today we're going to make a grill station with concrete countertops. So my friends over at Home Depot sent me this really nice Nexgrill and challenged me to build a project around it. It's stainless steel with heavy duty grills and has some really cool features like a push button battery powered electric igniter. I wanted a little extra countertop space on either side and some storage down below, so here's what I built. The majority of the structure is made out of 1-inch tube steel that I cut with an angle grinder. I like to use a silver Sharpie and a speed square to draw lines all the way around the steel tube. And this allows me to get really accurate cuts because all I have to do is follow the line with the angle grinder. For the cross supports, I needed a lot of pieces that were the same length, so I just clamped them together and made all the cuts at once. While the pieces were clamped together and I still had the grinder in my hand, I took this opportunity to clean up the ends of the steel and get them ready for welding. Now the two key tips that I have learned about welding is to prepare your material well. That means getting it all nice and clean and shiny before trying to weld the pieces together. The second is to rely on jigs to hold your pieces of metal firmly in place before you start welding so you get perfect angles. I like taking just a normal basic cheap steel square and then hot gluing little pieces of wood to raise it up off the ground a little bit, and this allows me to easily clamp it to the steel pieces. I was making this project up as I went along. I didn't have a set plan. I just knew that if I made some flat frames out of the steel, I could build those around the grill itself. I knew that the concrete countertops were going to be quite heavy, so I made sure to reinforce the frames with welds on both sides. This was all going really smoothly, but then I started thinking, what if there was a way I could clamp the pieces nice and square a little bit more quickly? So I took that same steel square, drilled some holes, and then cut some slots into it. I hot glued the wood spacers back on, and now I have a square that I can use cheap $1 spring clamps to clamp right to the pieces of steel that I want to weld. After finishing all the frames, I took the time to grind all the welds out nice and flat. This made it easier to clamp up and weld in the vertical supports. Welding is a lot of fun and it's easier to get into than you might think. All the steel work for this project was done with two power tools, an angle grinder to cut and prep the material, and my Forney welder set on MIG to stick it all together. At this point, I started thinking about how I would add in additional shelves, and I decided that they would be made out of wood and I would attach them to some 1-inch angle section that I would weld right into the frame. I cut a scrap piece to use as a vertical spacer, which I clamped to the frame, and then I used a magnet clamp and a level to make sure that the shelves would be nice and straight. For the legs of the station, I got some pieces of 2-inch by 2-inch angle steel that was 3/16 of an inch thick. After cutting the pieces to length, I clamped them all together and ground them all perfectly flush. I want these legs to fit right around the corners of the frame, but to do so, I'd have to do a little bit more grinding to clean up some of the corners. The legs now fit nicely around the corners, so I was ready to clean them up with a flap disc and then weld them on. I welded in a support that will go around the back of the grill but strengthen the whole structure. I also added in some additional cross members that can support the bottom shelves. And since I had the welder out, I decided to add a little bit more reinforcement to the welds between the legs and the structure. I placed the grill for a test fit and I saw that one of the pipes for the side burner was bumping into the steel, so I just cut out a little notch. I used a wire brush on my angle grinder to clean up all the welds. This is just to remove a little bit of the dust and splatter that comes from welding. I then sprayed on 2 coats of RUST-OLEUM rusty metal primer before finishing it with high performance enamel. The molds for the concrete countertops are pretty easy to make. I'm just going to rip some melamine to make the sides, and for the base, which is going to be the top of the concrete, I'm going to use a small piece of whiteboard that I bought at Home Depot. The whiteboard is even smoother than the melamine and will give the concrete countertop a real smooth finish. After wiping the dust off the pieces, I just hot glued them all together, making sure that the corners were nice and square. I only use a little bit of the hot glue underneath the sideboards, and then I really glue them down by running along the long outside corner, which also seals them and makes the mold waterproof. I use silicone caulking to seal the inside edges of the mold. The grill isn't perfectly symmetrical. One side has a burner, so I cut out a piece of styrofoam that was left over from some packaging to make a recess in the concrete that'll accommodate this burner. The piece of styrofoam I was using had some hollow parts, but I just taped over them with some Gorilla brand duct tape. Once I had created a rectangle that was the right size, I then hot glued it down to the whiteboard. I used more silicone caulk to again seal all the cracks and crevices. These countertops are going to be 4 inches thick, so to reduce the weight and to add a little bit of additional strength, I made a double layer plywood core. I just cut some plywood, glued and screwed it together, and then coated it with a polyacrylic finish. If you just try to set wood into concrete, it will float up to the surface. So I'm going to put a weight on it, but I don't want it to go too deep, so I screwed on a couple of scrap boards. I'm going for a dark gray concrete, so I mixed in a bottle of Quikrete pigment into 2 gallons of clean water. I then add about 3/4 of a gallon to 1 gallon of water for every bag of Quikrete 5000. I mixed the concrete until it was about the consistency of lumpy oatmeal and then placed it into the molds. I pushed it down a little bit with the hoe, but I didn't vibrate the concrete like I normally would. Vibrating the concrete will get out more of the air bubbles and it'll come out more like a smooth solid stone, but I was thinking that everything else in this grill station was going to be pretty smooth and slick, so I didn't mind if the edges were a little bit rough. I placed a plywood insert, added a couple weights on top, and then filled in around it with some more concrete. After letting the concrete cure for 48 hours, I stripped away the molds and flipped over the slabs. The styrofoam insert came right out, but on one of the slabs, some of the whiteboard had come off onto the concrete, so I just scraped that off with a razor blade. For the wood shelves, I'm going to use some leftover deck boards that I got from Advantage Lumber. These boards are a mix of different tropical hardwoods, and they're the ones that are left over, so they're a little bit warped. So I ripped them down into narrow strips and then rounded over the edges with my palm router. I sanded them smooth with an orbital sander and then finished them with teak oil. Cutting them into thin strips like this lets me blend together the different colors of the different species and hide a little bit of the warps. For the upper shelves, I'm going to drill through the angle steel and then just insert screws up into the wooden slats. Tropical hardwood is pretty dense, so it's a good idea to pre-drill your holes before screwing. For the lower shelves, I just screwed in some cross supports and then dropped them into place. The concrete countertops weigh about 160 pounds each, and I'm not worried about them sliding, but if you wanted to, you could use some construction adhesive just to be safe. I rinsed off the concrete and then sealed it with some paste wax. I rubbed on a thick coat, waited 15 minutes, and then rubbed off the excess. I wanted the stainless steel wings of the grill to go right over the concrete, so I just had to cut off a tiny little piece of it with my angle grinder. The upper shelves also intersected the hole where the tube for the gas is supposed to go, but no worries, I just used my angle grinder to cut through one of the vents and I just ran the hose through there. In the end, everything worked out. I cut out the notch for the gas for the burner, I cut a hole for the tube, and I notched out the concrete to fit the burner. I was just about done, but then I started thinking, how about I add just a little bit more support in the middle? So I welded on 2 additional legs to the middle support bars. This is the first big outdoor piece that I added to the container house, and I'm really happy with how it looks, but Let's see how it cooks. I hooked up a tank of propane and decided to make some steak and pepper sandwiches for the guys that were still finishing up the last bit of construction on the container house. The grill is fantastic. It's all stainless steel, it has a push button ignition, and it gets nice and hot. My addition adds plenty of counter space and a whole bunch of storage underneath. It was also a relatively affordable project. The steel I used cost less than $100, the concrete is just about $5 a bag, and you could really use any scrap lumber for the shelves. Now, this isn't the first outdoor kitchen project that we've done. You can check out the other videos here and here. If you want to see what we're working on next, be sure to follow us on Instagram. I'll put a link in the description box below, along with a lot of the products that we used. If you want to learn more about the concrete products that I use, be sure to check out Quikrete.com.